Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. This is another lecture about music history. Today, I am going to be diving a little deeper into the beginning of the Western musical tradition by examining the role and daily life of the monastic official known as the Cantor, specifically within the period of Carolingian monastic reform, which is also the period during which pneumatic notation was created and in widespread use. I'll also be discussing an early style of composition based on chant, known as a sequence. So to really begin, why does this even matter? Who cares about a cantor in the early Middle Ages? Well, as we discussed in the previous lecture, this period of European history is really defined around the Carolingian Empire, and likewise, this period of music history is centered around the monastic reforms that took place within that empire. In terms of monastic life, the architect of this reform was Benedict of Aniane, an 8th and 9th century monk in the Carolingian Empire. Benedict was a bit of a stickler. He found himself abbot of a monastery, but felt he wasn't able to assert the kind of authority that he wanted there. The reason that he wanted authority, of course, presumably being to glorify God. No other reason. So when he couldn't make everyone do what he said, he took his ball and ran back to his father's estate. Rich guys, am I right? Started a few other monasteries, which didn't really work out, before he landed on the Benedictine style of monastery. And that's a different Benedict. For the sake of clarity, I'll refer to the Benedict of the Rule of St. Benedict and Benedictine monasteries as the first Benedict, and Benedict of Aniane as the second Benedict. The Rule of St. Benedict is a set of rules written as guidelines for monastic living in the 6th century by Benedict of Nursia, Benedict I. The rule was just a set of regula around which monks or nuns could organize themselves, but it achieved a certain amount of popularity for advocating a balance between religious zeal and day-to-day practicality. It's important to remember that from outside the monastery, say if you were an emperor who got into a lot of fights, Charlemagne for example, the appeal of a monastery and providing it with support was, in your view, extremely practical. This is because the extreme observance of the Christian religion by monks and nuns, and their bodily purity and chastity, specifically a feature of the Benedictine rule, was thought to increase the power of the prayer generated by that monastery or nunnery to influence real-world events. If you are picturing a fantasy novel-style cleric who suddenly receives an ability to give their holy powers a boost, you're not far off from how a king might have viewed a monastery, which is a very practical reason for being desirous of the spread of Benedictine rule, which itself became increasingly popular in the 8th century in what's now England, and it's likely that that's how the second Benedict came across it as an organizational tool. So, that's it, right? Benedict II just reformed all the monasteries in the Carolingian Empire, and there you go. Well, obviously it wasn't so simple. In a section titled The Bumpy Road to Una Regula, one rule, in the Cambridge History of Medieval Monasticism in the Latin West, Albrecht D.M. and Philip Rousseau have this to say. The short version of the Carolingian Benedictine takeover sounds simple and convenient. Carolingian rulers and reform-minded monks, inspired initially by Anglo-Saxon monks, realized that the Rule of St. Benedict was indeed excellent in its discretion and splendid in its language. They imposed the text as the single legal norm on all monasteries. Monks are monks, and monasteries are monasteries because they follow the Rule of St. Benedict. This process found its culmination in the Reform Councils of 813 under Charlemagne and of 816 to 17 under Louis the Pious. Benedict of Aniane played a key role in this process and expanded the Una Regula with a catalogue of explanations, slight alterations, and additions to the rule. But as the authors go on to say in the very next paragraph, the true catalogue of events is much more complex. The process of resistance to monastic reform seemed to focus not against the switching of rules from one organizational principle to the Benedictine rule, but rather to following a set of rules at all. Early Christian communities of monks, which at the time had a much broader definition, were probably small enough that no organizing principle was needed, assuming no power-hungry Benedict II was around, that is. Interestingly, Benedict II was actually very concerned about abbots overstepping their authority, One of the main draws of the rule of St. Benedict, aside from its increasing inclusion as a matter of conditional principle in monarchical land grants to monasteries, of course, was that the rule allowed organizations of monks to elect their own leader, which, on the surface, has the potential to stop a power-hungry monk from achieving their ends. In reality, of course, we know that only those who are actually desirous of power put themselves forward for election in the first place. Hold on. How can this possibly relate to cantors and the practice of plainchant? Well, it's all a part of the process of church reform, and of course, part of the liturgical form that began the process of musical notation, which we can directly trace to modern-day Western notation, meaning neumes. So, now that we've set aside Benedict I and II, who, by the way, later satisfied his thirst for power by becoming the abbot of all Frankish monasteries, a role analogous to an archbishop or cardinal, what would the daily life of a cantor inside one of these monasteries have been like? Well, in some ways, we have very little information. In fact, we have very little verifiable information generally about the history and goings-on of the medieval period. What information there was transmitted orally or possibly put down in parchment, an expensive and unwieldy material which, like anything made from an animal, had a tendency to rot and become unreadable. A cantor was only mentioned in the rule of St. Benedict once, and he does not elaborate on the function of this office. But what the cantor became, especially during the Carolingian reforms, was an increasingly important role. The cantor supervised music making of all types, oversaw the library and scriptorum, where new books were created, and directed the celebration of the liturgy. In spite of the obvious importance of the role, in the most recent article I could find, from 1985, Margot Fassler laments the limited amount of scholarship available on this important position, even in the field of musicology, but also in Christian monastic study generally. To confirm her point, the much more recent Cambridge History of Monasticism I mentioned earlier, which is a 2-volume work totaling 1,200 pages, only includes the word cantor 14 times. So as you can imagine, most of this information about cantors comes from Fassler, but there are a handful of others as well. With what little information I have available to me, I've assembled a kind of day-in-the-life snapshot of what being a medieval cantor might have looked like, which I've combined with a Christmas Day Matins service laid out in Jeremy Yudkin's book on medieval music. Picture this. It's December, and you're a 50-year-old monk. Suddenly, you're shaken awake by the weekly cantor. He's your assistant, and a spry 35 years old. You've been sleeping in lately, and you're not really sure why. Probably just getting older. But now you realize it must be close to 2 a.m. Time for the first worship of the day, Matins. And this isn't your average Matins, which is performed every day at 2 a.m. This is Matins on Christmas Day, which is when the church celebrates the birth of their God, the Christ. Matins can last anywhere from 15 minutes, including just a few psalms, or, on a day like today, 2 to 3 hours. You stretch slightly and take your place near the front of the line of monks. You are near the front of the line due to your high office within the monastery. Yours is a relatively small monastery in Brittany, so you're in 4th place behind the abbot, the leader of the monastery, the cellarer, who manages the food of monks and also all the wares and stores that go in and out, and the guestmaster, who in your monastery not only manages important guests, but more often is in charge of providing shelter to those who need it and giving them a small amount of food, or what medical care he can. You're actually pulling triple duty as well. You're in charge of the small library here, where a new book called a tonary has arrived. For some reason, your assistant is very excited about it. Apparently it's a new way to write down the psalms to aid your memory. Not that you need it. You spent a decade memorizing over 500 chants in Rome, and your assistant has been slowly learning to do the same thing with your help. You also run the scriptorium, where new books and documents are created. Quite enough to be getting on with. Behind you is the sacrist, who takes care of the church building, and the remaining monks follow behind in order of seniority. Your assistant, who will be leading the monks and sing the responses to your antiphon, is in the front third of the group. Once in chapel, just a humble wooden building, this isn't a cathedral, which would be the seat of a bishop and might be made of stone, you take your place near the front of the room. As one of the monks in a position of authority, you'll have to attend your duties, which involve not only singing the antiphon before each psalm by memory and arranging which psalms will be sung during the service, but also keeping an eye on the other monks to make sure they aren't goofing off or even falling asleep. Falling asleep past 2 a.m. Young people today. SMH. The monk you've assigned the hebdomadry, a rotating position which you designate who initiates responsories and services, has started their recitation. The recitation which begins all Matins, not just Christmas, after which will follow the response by the choir. Luckily, both the hebdomadry and your assistant are the capable sort, and you don't have to worry about this going well. After a few more responsories, it's your time to shine. The opening psalm for Matins is always the same, but on Christmas Day, the antiphon is different. You'll sing the antiphon alone, and the choir will repeat it. It's been over a year since you even thought of this psalm, but it appears as clear as day in your mind's ear, and your powerful voice floats through the church.
Christus
The introduction section of Matins is coming to a close, but you're about to lead the brothers in a hymn, which Benedict of Agnan prescribes singing at the end of each introductory section of the offices. This hymn is also unique to Christmas, meaning you haven't thought of it for over a year, and have also only sung it around 20 times in your life as the cantor. But still, you remember it perfectly.
Christe
The rest of the service, though unusually long, proceeds as a normal Matins office. It includes 5 total sections. The introduction, which we just moved through, includes recitations and the invitation psalm with antiphon. 3 nocturnes follow, which all have the same structure. 3 psalms with antiphon openings, followed by 3 lessons, which are readings from the scripture. As cantor, your responsibility would be for the antiphonal sections of each of the psalms. An antiphon is a short sentence or phrase sung between the verses of a psalm. So you would sing a solo antiphon, and the choir, led by the weekly cantor, would sing the psalm. After all 3 nocturnes conclude, you will sing the Te Deum, which always ends Matin services regardless of whether it's Christ's Mass. This will similarly involve alternating solo and choir sections.
Te Deum laudamus, Te omnes angeli, tibi celi et universae potestates, tibi cherubim et seraphim, incessabili voce proclamant, Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth.
The remainder of your day will be quite busy. It is Christmas, after all, the second most important liturgical day of the year. But the following is always your worship schedule. At 2 a.m., you have Matins, which could be anywhere from 15 minutes to 3 hours. At daybreak, the service of Lauds, about 45 minutes. Prime at 6 a.m., Terce at 9 a.m., Sext at noon, and Non at 3 p.m., each lasting roughly 15 to 30 minutes. Vespers at sunset and Compline just before bedtime, probably around 9 or so, were about 30 minutes each. In addition to the Mass between Terce and Sext, which would occur every day, on Christmas there would be 3 full Masses. An initial Mass at sunrise, which is Lauds, and a third at sundown, Vespers, around 6 hours of religious worship every single day. On Christmas more, and on a normal day a bit less. In addition to that, you'd have other duties like managing the books, doing your own study, and, as mentioned, assisting your weekly cantor with his memorization. Although toneries are starting to be more common, chant was still passed through oral recitation, and new cantors were known to take at least a decade to train. Stepping outside of my telling of a cantor's daily life, let's discuss memory and memorization. As I said, these monks were memorizing this chant. And what I like about the Christmas Matins office, as an example, is that it so clearly demonstrates how amazing this truly was. Had you been a cantor, you really might not have sung any of the specific sections for Christmas for a full year, but you would be expected to have them memorized perfectly. Anna Maria Berger, in her book Medieval Music and the Art of Memory, puts forth an argument that notation, both pneumatic and the later invented diastemic notation by Guido Arezzo, were actually tools used to aid the process of memorization, rather than tools to help one recall what one already knew. The distinction may seem subtle, but using notation as a tool to aid memorization implies that it was never meant to be used by professional cantors as a memory aid, as is sometimes suggested. A tonary, such as the most famous Carolingian one found at the cathedral at Metz, may have been meant as something to copy pneumatic notation out of, not something to be read. And let me tell you, the sheer quantity of material which needed to be memorized makes it clear why an aid was needed. This passage from Berger's book is illustrative. What exactly did one memorize? Students learned to read by reciting the Psalter, first combining letters into syllables, syllables into words, and then words into sentences. Since they did not know Latin, at first they did not know what they were reciting. The term psalteratus referred to somebody who knew how to read. But even monks who did not learn how to read eventually memorized the Psalter by rote. Benedict required the entire Psalter of 150 psalms to be sung every week. When a psalm was performed in the divine office, it was framed by an antiphon, of which there existed 3,000 or more by the end of the Middle Ages. As for the Mass, Michel Huglot has computed that the 8th and 9th century gradual contained about 560 chants, 70 introits, 118 graduals, 100 alleluias, 18 tracts, 107 offertories, and 150 communions. Kenneth Levy has calculated that if one adds to this the office propers, we might come to 75 or 80 hours of memorized material. This would correspond to the entire selection of Beethoven's instrumental works, plus the full Wagnerian canon. Before I move on to Richard Taruskin's book, I'd like to mention Nuns. Although it is sometimes theorized that both monks and nuns had equal autonomy in the early church, some even going so far as to suggest that this religious order may have been considered something like a third, non-binary gender, Isabel Reel, in an essay titled Nuns and Monks at Work, Equality or Distinction Between the Sexes, a study of Frankish monasteries from the 6th to the 10th century, shows that nuns were very obviously considered distinct from monks according to the labor they completed, which fell along what continue to be considered gender norms. Gender norms are, of course, a fiction, but generally follow the guideline of women working within the home and men working outside of it. As much as your local patriarch might want you to think, there is no reason a woman might not swing an axe or till a field, and a man can't embroider robes for the bishop or abbess, simply by virtue of the fact that in the Catholic Church, bishops, cardinals, and even popes were, and continue to be, exclusively male. We know that this notion of medieval gender equality, or religious non-binary status, in the Church is a fiction. Having said that, nunneries or convents did not always exist tied to a monastery. Some existed as distinct dwellings, which of course implies an all-women community. And it follows that in these communities, women did much or all of the work that would have been taken on by men in a combination monastery and convent. It also follows that there were nuns who were cantors. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find much information on this, which obviously doesn't mean that there isn't any, but I did find one nun, Edber of Winchester. She lived from the 920s to the 950s and was the daughter of King Edward the Elder, a Saxon king and son of the more famous King Alfred. Edber's life is largely a mystery to us, as much of the information we have about her comes from hagiographies, which are histories of saints' lives written several centuries after their death, and are more church propaganda than actual history. What we do know is that she held the position of preceptor. A preceptor is a monastic position which is considered to be synonymous with cantor. It seems unlikely to me that Edber was the only nun before the end of the first millennia to be a cantor, so I think it's a safe assumption that nuns did regularly fill this role. In addition to the notational practice of neumes and its direct lineage to modern Western notation, this time period is also the beginning of a compositional process involving plain chant. Although monophony would eventually go out of style, plain chant will dominate religious music for the next several centuries. Richard Taruskin's second chapter in the Oxford History of Western Music is titled New Styles and Forms, Frankish Additions to the Repertory, and deals with the initial evolutions of a kind of composition which took place in the medieval church. Not surprisingly, in religious communities where there was little else to do other than study, singing could become quite competitive. In fact, treating music as if it were a competition is something which has still not left the field. Professional musical positions of any kind are won, not received. Competition is very much built into the fabric of Western music, and this is its beginning. We have writing from various monks. Amelar, who endorsed the practice of adding melismatic sections to existing chant, a melisma being the technique of singing multiple pitches on one syllable, rather than just one pitch per syllable. We'll hear an example later. And from another monk, Abelard, who Taruskin writes, "From childhood to old age, Abelard complained. The singers in the Scala spent all their time improving their voices instead of their souls, boasted of their virtuosity and their memories, and vied with one another in melismatic contest." The process of composing music began, like many things in this history, unintentionally. First up in our discussion of music is a series of elaborate melismatic chants known as the Pneuma Triplex. This series of 3 melismas was sung as a replacement for the end of certain chants on specific holy days. In order to aid in the process of memorization for these melismas, syllabic prose was added to the chant. These prosulae became a rich compositional tradition within the church and flourished until the 12th century. The name for the piece of music that grew out of the original melismatic chants is a sequence, and Notker Balbulus, who was also Charlemagne's first biographer, is the original source of its documentation. In Notker's book, Liber Hymnorum, Taruskin writes, Notker recalls that in his youth he learned the practice from a monk who had escaped from the West Frankish abbey of Jumieges, near Rouen in northwestern France, after it had been laid waste by marauding Normans. This would have been in 852. This monk, Notker tells us, had with him an antiphoner in which some sequentia melismas had been prosulated. Notker, so he tells us, leapt at this device for making extra-long vocalises, longissima melody, he calls them, memorable, and went on, so he boasts, to invent what we now call the sequence. Taruskin uses the example of an Alleluia and a sequence by Notker called Angelorum Ordo. Unfortunately, I couldn't find recordings of these two which sounded as if they were actually based off the same chant. This would probably be my main criticism of Taruskin's books. The examples he uses for plain chant in pneumatic notation, and now moving through various types of composition, demonstrate his point visually. But as in the last chapter with the Hyrrian hymn, they aren't backed up by any actual interpretations of the music, or at least recordings that I could find. So I found a separate Alleluia called Latatus Sum. Notker turned this melismatic chant into a syllabic sequence here in Salat Ecclesia.
Salat Ecclesia mater illibata, et virgos in eruga honoremus ecclesiae.
As you can no doubt see and hear, the notation for these two chants are the same, but one is melismatic and one is syllabic. Remember, these syllabic rewritings of chants were, at least initially, used as tools to memorize the melismas. Probably the most famous example of a sequence is the polyphonic composition Rex Caelid. The piece was famous in its time, and although we don't know when exactly it was composed, we know that in the late 9th century it was sufficiently famous that it was used as an educational image in Musica and Curiatus, or a music handbook, which dates between 860 to 900, and is an early Frankish guide to practical singing. This piece is also a reminder that although monophony may have been a dominant style of singing, that is, music with only one melodic line, as most chant is, polyphony, music with multiple melodic lines, was also in use. You can see on the screen the illustration in Musica and Curiatus, and a modern notational example of Rex Caelid. Taruskin writes, the upper voice sings the original Rex Caelid melody, for which reason it is called the principal voice, vox principalis. The lower voice, called the vox originalis because it produces the harmony or counterpoint, called organum at the time, begins at the unison and holds on to its initial pitch as a drone until the principal voice has reached the interval of a fourth above it, the smallest interval considered consonant according to the music theory of the time. At this point, the two voices move in parallel until the cadence, or accursus as it was called, meaning the coming together, which restores the unison. In the second phrase, the augmented fourth against B is avoided by sustaining the organal G, and then by leaping to E. Once again, unison is restored at the end. Although Rex Caled may be a unique example, the main takeaway of this style of composition, and of my section on being a cantor, as well as the processes of teaching and learning chant, is that memorization of the chant, made necessary by the homogenizing force of the Carolingian Empire, was likely the primary motivator in the development of these styles of composition, as well as notation generally. I hope you enjoyed this lecture about the life of a medieval cantor, an abbreviated guide through the service of Matins, and one of the earliest styles of composition in the Western tradition, known as sequences. If you have any comments, please let me know below, and if you're able, consider joining my Patreon for any amount, where you can access benefits like early access to videos, the ability to vote on pieces that I analyze, and access to files of my analyzed scores, scripts for these videos, and portions of the documents I use in research.